Welcome to Politicking. I'm Larry King. An historic summit looms between United States President Donald Trump and Russia's leader Vladimir Putin at a time of increased tensions between their two nations. Mr. Trump has signaled that serious sanctions, military exercises, and election meddling may be on the agenda. But what does Moscow want from this high-stakes face-to-face? We'll find out now as I talk to Russia's longtime foreign minister, S.Lavrov, who joins me from Moscow. Mr. Foreign Minister, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation, Larry.
Okay, let's get right into it. At a wrap-up of the NATO summit, which just ended, President Trump and other members agreed to a joint statement which, among other things, condemned your country's, they called it illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, also reaffirmed support for Ukraine's aspirations to become a member of NATO. What, Mr. Foreign Minister, is your reaction to this?
You know, there is nothing new in these statements. We have been hearing them for quite a number of years. So we take it as inertia by the Cold War thinking, nothing more than that.
I thought the Cold War was over.
Well, that's why inertia of the Cold War, unfortunately, is still with NATO. And it's high time for NATO to leave it behind it.
So when they say your annexation of Crimea was illegal and illegitimate, you say that's not true?
No, it is not true. The current status of Crimea was determined by the people who live there in a referendum, which was free and fair, which was attended by many of international observers. Not official delegations from any country or from any international organization, but international observers, human rights activists, and this was certainly done in a much more transparent and legitimate way than the unilateral recognition of Kosovo independence without any referendum. And by the way, it's interesting, speaking of rules-based order, as our Western friends like to say, you know, they try to invent rules for each individual case. And then they say this is sui generis, this is unique. And for any other issue which we might not like, there would be other rules. I was told by a friend that our British colleagues, when the General Assembly of the United Nations is supposed to discuss the situation on the Malvinas or Falkland Islands, they sent instructions to the ambassadors all over the world saying that you must convince the country of your posting that they should recognize that the status of the Falkland Islands was determined by a free and fair referendum of the people who live there, in full agreement with the United Nations Charter, in full agreement with the principle of self-determination of peoples, and the fact that Argentinian government introduced sanctions because of that referendum is illegitimate and should be condemned. So I hope you understand what kind of parallel I'm trying to draw.
I get it. At his news conference Thursday, President Trump said that the NATO allies have stepped up like never before on defense spending. He also called the alliance a fine-tuned machine. Mr. Foreign Minister, what are your thoughts about NATO?
Well, NATO is a reality. It's an atavism of Cold War times, but it is a reality, and we take it as a reality. We don't believe that what NATO is doing by trying to expand further and further, closer to Russian borders, swallowing countries who, frankly, do not add to the security of the alliance. We don't believe that this is the way to resolve the problems of today. Today, we have common threats, common enemies terrorism, climate change, organized crime, drug trafficking, and none of this is being effectively addressed by NATO expansion. NATO should certainly be taken as a reality, as I said, but NATO should understand that it is something which cannot dictate to each and every other country how to handle the international security matters. Dialogue is required. We have been proposing many things to NATO which we can do together. Counterterrorism, then the discussions of military doctrines, discussion of transparency measures in military buildup. All this was frozen after the events in Crimea, after the referendum in Crimea. And NATO took the approach that exactly the same approach as it took when in 2008 in August, then President Saakashvili of Georgia launched a war against his own people in South Ossetia. And then we demanded a convening of NATO-Russia Council, but Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at that time, said, no way, we cannot discuss anything with an aggressor, quote unquote. Then she corrected herself and all NATO members agreed that NATO must be all-weather, NATO-Russia Council must be all-weather forum, and that especially at the time of crisis, it should function on the basis of equality and taken into account mutual, interests of each other. So after the Crimean referendum, which was free and fair, as I said, and as many international observers assert, the mistake was repeated once again. And as of the defense expenditure, even without any further rise, the current statistics is that NATO, together with the United States, spends about 20 times more than Russia spends on its defense. And without the United States, the Europeans spent about 4 times more than Russia spends on its defense budget. I assume that it might be partially related to the productivity of labor, to the difference in productivity of labor, but this cannot be the only explanation.
How did you react when President Trump said that Germany is totally controlled by Russia?
My spokesman, Maria Zakharova, addressed this issue, I think, yesterday, when she gave facts that we sell gas to Germany, which is business, and the United States has dozens of thousands of military men and women on the German soil, and a few dozens military bases. And then any international observer having these statistics in front of him or her should make their own conclusions. I can only quote what President Trump said when he was asked whether President Putin is his enemy or his friend. He said he's a competitor, a strong competitor, and I believe we can get along with him. And I hope we one day might become friends. But speaking of competition, I always believed in free competition because free market is about fair competition. And when speaking of gas and Germany, United States Secretary of Energy, Mr. Perry, yesterday I think, said that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline must be stopped, and those European countries whose companies would be participating in this project would be sanctioned by the United States because the United States is for competition, and for the sake of competition there must be new terminals to receive American liquefied natural gas. Some competition, I would say. And of course, if Russian authoritarian gas is supposed to be worse than the democratic American gas, then I am awfully sorry, but this is not economy, this is not competition. This is pure ideology and unfair competition.
Mr. Foreign Minister, are you going to accompany Mr. Putin to Helsinki?
Yes, I would be there, as well as Secretary Pompeo. We had a couple of conversations with Mike Pompeo. We discussed what kind of arrangements we should foresee for the meeting in Helsinki. And parallel to the meeting between the two presidents, which they want to start one-on-one, we would be meeting with Mike, with ambassadors to Russia and to the United States respectively. And we will discuss any issue which each of us would like to raise. There would be no fixed agenda, but there are obvious items which would certainly pop up.
The two presidents will meet alone. By the way, I've interviewed Mr. Putin. I know him quite a few times. And when I've been with him, he doesn't speak English. Are there going to be interpreters at that private meeting between the two presidents?
Yes, there would be interpreters. President Putin actually understands English, but for the sake of better expressing his views, he prefers to use the interpreters' good offices.
Will there'll be no other aides in the room? You will not be in the room?
Well, as things stand now, that's what the American side proposed, and we are polite people, so we agreed.
All right, what are you looking forward to from the summit? What, from the Russian standpoint, will be a successful summit?
Well, a beginning of normal communications. Most channels of communications established during last 7, 8, 10 years have been frozen on very important issues: counterterrorism, energy, drug trafficking, cybersecurity, many others, Afghanistan, other regional conflicts. What we have now is sporadic meetings between diplomats and the military, mostly on Syria. We also have a channel on Ukraine, where the aide of President Putin and a special envoy of the United States met several times, but with no visible progress, because our American colleagues try every time they meet with their Russian counterparts to deviate radically from the Minsk agreements, which underlie the consensus on the Ukrainian crisis. But we keep trying, and I hope that we would certainly discuss this issue in Helsinki. But back to your question regarding the ideal outcome would be to agree to engage all the channels on all the issues which are divisive on the one hand, trying to see whether we can get closer on those exact topics, and also on those issues where we now can usefully cooperate for the sake of interests of the two countries and for the sake of interest of international community, like strategic stability, for example.
Are you optimistic about the summit?
Well, I'm not paid to be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm paid to be realistic, and we try to stick to the reality. We'll see what the reality looks like.
Okay. What do you view as, you know, we've had great relations when Mr. Gorbachev was in, and Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Bush got along very well. Clinton got along very well. When did these countries start to part? I know Mr. Trump said we should be friends. When it seemed things were going well and then not well, how would you describe America-Russian relations right now?
Well, it's very unfortunate that we have our relations in this state. I believe it all started, as President Putin many times described to the audience he addressed, including to the American audience. It all started when the United States began to understand that Russia wants to have its own view of how to build its own country, how to protect its own security, and how to organize its own development. After the demise of the Soviet Union, the American and Western influence in general on what was going on in Russia was very big, and the United States probably believed that as from that time, the Russian leadership would follow the Western line on everything. And that was you remember when Francis Fukuyama called it end of history, meaning that as of that moment, as of the moment of disappearance of the Soviet Union, there would be only one civilization, Western civilization, with all its values, rules, and everything else, which would determine how the world affairs are run. And Russia believed that given its millennium history, given its traditions, given its national character, given its values, including orthodox values, spiritual values, that Russia also has the right to have a say in world affairs on the equal basis, on the basis of universal respect for international law, but having its own voice. And we wanted this voice to be received as a voice of an equal partner, which was originally promised when NATO-Russia Council was created, when OSCE convened a summit where all leaders, heads of state and government, proclaimed their determination to respect indivisible security, the principle which provides for any country not to strengthen its own security at the expense of weakening the security of others. Then at some point, when the United States dropped from the Missile Defense Treaty unilaterally, that's when the revisionism began, by the way, which continues until now. The United States dropped from so many international agreements, which is really an attempt to revise the international order. And when the US dropped from the Missile Defense Treaty, it became very clear that this violated the principle that no one should increase his security at the expense of security of others. Then we proposed to make this principle of indivisible and equal security not just a political commitment, but a legally binding principle. And we proposed in 2007, 2008, to conclude a treaty by all members of OSCE, a treaty on European security, which would codify as a legally binding principle the commitment not to increase your own security at the expense of the security of others. And the answer by NATO members was no way. The only place where a country can get legal guarantees for its security is NATO. I hope you don't need me to explain in details that this was a very unfortunate decision of NATO. It indicated that what NATO actually wanted is to pool inside the alliance more and more members and getting closer and closer to the borders of the Russian Federation, thus violating another commitment NATO members accepted in the context of OSCE summits, not to keep and not to move to the east dividing lines. But on the contrary, they committed together with us to eliminate those dividing lines. So all this in combination, and those are just few examples of how things deteriorated during that period, all this brought us to understand that if, for example, Missile Defense Treaty was no longer valid because the United States dropped from it. You mentioned President Bush. George Bush Jr. Told President Putin at that time in 2002, when President Putin said that this was a mistake in his view to drop from this treaty, he said, well, we need to build missile defense system. It is not against you. It is against other countries. He mentioned Iran, North Korea. That's why he said, do whatever you want in response to our leaving the treaty, because we would take it as also not being aimed against us. That's where we started to develop these new weapons which could overcome missile defense, because we don't want to find ourselves in a situation when we would be armless in front of a United States, which would have strategic weapons, but also would have a strategic missile defense shield. It would be a very tempting combination, so we're just doing something which we need in this particular situation to defend our own security, nothing more. We are not going to attack anyone, but we would be protected very well to counter any attack against us.
What? Mr. Foreign Minister, what does your country think of the United States and its sort of agreement with North Korea? Do you think that's good for the world, bad from a Russian viewpoint?
Well, I think it's good for the world. We strongly support the efforts undertaken by President Trump, also by the President of South Korea, to build up the atmosphere which would be conducive to resolving the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula and to bring all of us to denuclearization. And from the very beginning, we suggested, together with China, that a first step must be confidence building. And the second step should be some confidence building measures, like freezing launches and tests, like freezing the military games. And I believe that what is going on is going in the right direction. I know that the outcome of the meeting in Singapore between President Trump and leader of North Korea is being criticized by many as just, being empty words on paper without any beef in it. Later, Secretary Pompeo visited Pyongyang, and then he was also criticized for not delivering any specific hard commitments for denuclearization. But I think serious analysts understand that this thing cannot be done overnight. It has been a very deep crisis with very serious consequences, which might affect many countries if things went wrong. And we have to build confidence gradually, and that's, I believe, what President Trump and Secretary Pompeo help to do. We support these efforts, and we try to contribute in our contacts with North Koreans and with other players in that region.
It's good to hear. Okay. The unanimous conclusion by the entire American intelligence community is that your government influenced the American elections in 2016, and that President Trump will tell President Putin to not do it again. How do you react to all of this and your country's involvement in American elections? Your reaction?
Well, I've seen those reports, but with all respect, Larry, I cannot agree that this was a report, as you said, by the entire American intelligence community. Those who are interested can take a look at a piece written by former American ambassador to Moscow, Jack Matlock, who described the report produced regarding the alleged Russian interference and showed inefficiencies and inaccuracies and inconsistencies in filing this report without, for example, expressing the view which the military intelligence held. It's a report signed only by 3 agencies out of a dozen of intelligence agencies the United States has and who normally would participate in anything called the opinion of the entire intelligence community of the United States. Then I saw the report of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which asserted and alleged that Russia has been interfering with elections, that there is proof, and then no single fact was produced, and then it was announced that the full report would be made secret because of sensitive information. it's exactly the same approach as we see in our relations with the United Kingdom, who accused us 10 years ago of poisoning one of the former intelligence officer who resided in London, Mr. Litvinenko. And the trial, which concluded that Russia was responsible, was also secret. Now the investigation of this Salisbury poisoning is also going on without any transparent information being provided to the public, without anything given to us, including access to a Russian citizen, and so on and so forth. Now this is becoming contagious, I believe, and highly likely thing. And the assertion that there is no other credible explanation is becoming a rule on which the Western friends try to base their policy on Russia. The latest event in Greece is absolutely going in the same vein, highly likely. We are not given any single fact. And back to the American elections, I've spent some time in the United States, so I believe I understand how the system is working. And when a year and a half or even more investigation goes on, hearings go on, the special counselor, Mr. Mueller, dozens of people participating in the hearing, being interrogated, and the only thing the public gets is the assertion that it is proven again and again that Russia did meddle. We're still thinking whether this meddling did have effect on the outcome of elections or not, and so on and so forth. But apart from these assertions, there is no single fact. And knowing the American system, I'm convinced that with so many people involved in all these hearings, closed, public, secret, not secret, it is impossible that no single fact has been leaked so far yet into the public domain. The US system is leaking very often and very well, and especially on an issue like this, when so many people are involved, it's impossible not to have any single fact presented to the public one way or another. But I can assure you that, this was...
So you categorically deny any Russian involvement?
President Putin addressed this issue several times. He once again confirmed a few days ago, actually, a couple of weeks ago, that the Russian government has nothing to do with what was going on during the American elections. We have been reading about somebody else's meddling with the Democratic Party side, but this fact, which has been proven, by the way, is not mentioned at all when this electoral campaign issue is being discussed. What we did say was that we are ready to answer any questions the American administration might have regarding this matter. This was actually offered by us when President Putin met with President Trump 1 year ago in the margins of G20 in Hamburg. And we thought there was an agreement that a group of experts would be meeting. The Americans would put on the table all the issues which they believe Russia must explain, and then the experts would do this. Somehow, a few days after the summit, under the pressure of those who believe that the administration should not discuss anything on cybersecurity with Russia, this deal was postponed. Lately, there were signals that the Americans are ready to resume this attempt, and we would be ready to discuss any concerns regarding cybersecurity which the United States might have. Speaking of cybersecurity and freedom of expression and so on and so forth, we are concerned that RT, which is not foreign to you, is being labeled by, for example, the French government as agent of influence. And the same French government introduced a draft law to the parliament which is intended to compile a blacklist of media outlets which are suspected of spreading fake news. And even more seriously, this blacklist would be accompanied by compiling at the government level, at the legislature level, a list of media resources which would be recommended to national regulators of cyberspace as reliable sources. If it is not censorship, if it is not an attempt to squeeze the space of expression, then I don't understand much in this life.
Well, I can say that concerning this program, which is on RT and other sources, RT has never interfered with this show at all, never edited us, never censored us or anything. So I'd go on record as saying that. I want to add one more thing, Mr. Foreign Minister. How, morally, how can you support someone like Assad in Syria, who has been so brutal to his own people? How can you support him in a civilization? How can you support him?
Well, I think you, being a politician, I mean, some people say being a politician is being cynical. Some say healthy cynicism is good. I believe we have to be realistic, and we have to be responsible, first of all, for the world security, for security of our countries, for the cooperation with others which would create conditions making our people safer. And if you take a look in retrospect at that region, Saddam Hussein was a dictator. Muammar Gaddafi was a dictator. But if you compare the sufferings of the people of Iraq and Libya respectively under these two dictators and at present, after the American and NATO intervention in Iraq and in Libya, in violation of international law, then I believe the numbers of those who were killed, who were wounded, who fled their homes, would be probably hundreds of thousands more than those who suffered under these regimes. And the same is true for Syria. The people who ruined Iraq, who ruined Libya, who now try to invite the international community to share responsibility for the migrants crisis, the same people draw no conclusions, and they wanted to put Syria in the same state. Some analysts say that the United States might be interested in keeping this region in turmoil so that it can fish in these muddy waters. I don't believe this is what the United States wants, but when you look at the facts, it's what's happening. It's what's happening. And this is not to say that we want to justify dictators, but it's to say that before you start an adventure, you must make every step not to be reckless and to find a way to promote democratic changes peacefully, like the United States do in many countries of the same very region. I don't need to list them. So my point is that we condemn any violations of human rights, any violations of international humanitarian law, whoever commit them, governments, opposition, foreign countries interfering, but we have to see the entire picture, and we have to think about the price of being moral just for the sake of being moral.
So you include Syria in that statement?
Yes, that's what you asked me about.
Yeah. I'm very glad to hear that. Mr. Foreign Minister, thank you so much for giving us your time today. Have a successful trip to Helsinki, and let's hope that when we meet in person, we have peace in the world. Wouldn't that be nice?
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much for the invitation.